It's everything, Harry. Everything is gone. Andrea's voice shattered over the phone, choked with the smoke and sorrow of a lifetime's promise burning to the ground. The old man, shivering on the cold Oklahoma pavement, heard the cries of a little girl named Wendy in the background and knew his deception had just collided with God's judgment. He wasn't Harry, a homeless man. He was Harrison Kane, a billionaire who had just tested the one woman who could save his soul, and in doing so, might have just destroyed her. Welcome back to Epic Narrative Tales. Here we release daily, captivating, emotional stories for your enjoyment. Be sure to watch this video to the end. The Oklahoma sky stretched vast and blue over Marland Mansion, a Gilded Age palace of limestone and ambition rising from the plains of Ponca City. Inside the grand library, surrounded by the silent, leather-bound ghosts of other men's thoughts, Harrison Kane felt the familiar weight of his own. He stood before a towering 6-foot portrait of his late wife, her painted eyes full of a gentle wisdom he had rarely heeded in life and desperately missed in death. It was in her memory that he had doubled, then tripled the Kane fortune. It was for her legacy that he guarded it with the ferocity of a dragon. "She's a good woman, Dad." His son Ethan's voice was earnest, hopeful, coming from one of the plush leather armchairs. "If you just give her a chance." Harrison turned from the portrait, his eyes the color of a winter sky fixing on his son. Ethan was a good boy, his mother's son through and through. He had her kind heart and her trusting nature. In Harrison's world, these were not assets, they were liabilities. "Goodness is not the issue, Ethan. Stability is. Predictability," Harrison said, his voice the low rumble of unquestioned authority. "This woman, Andrea Smith, she comes from nothing. She has no connections, no family of note. We know nothing about her, and in 3 months, you plan to make her advance. You plan to give her access to a legacy that has taken 3 generations of blood and sacrifice to build." "She's a good woman, Dad." His son Ethan's voice was earnest, hopeful, coming from one of the plush leather armchairs. "If you just give her a chance." Harrison turned from the portrait, his eyes the color of a winter sky fixing on his son. Ethan was a good boy, his mother's son through and through. He had her kind heart and her trusting nature. In Harrison's world, these were not assets, they were liabilities. "Goodness is not the issue, Ethan. Stability is. Predictability," Harrison said, his voice the low rumble of unquestioned authority. "This woman, Andrea Smith, she comes from nothing. She has no connections, no family of note. We know nothing about her, and in 3 months, you plan to make her advance. You plan to give her access to a legacy that has taken 3 generations of blood and sacrifice to build." "Her name is Kane now, Dad, or it will be," Ethan corrected gently. "And what I plan to do is marry the woman I love, the woman God put in my path." Harrison winced at the mention of God. It was another of his son's gentle follies, a faith as intangible and, in his view, as unreliable as the stock market. "And you don't think," Harrison pressed, moving to his massive oak desk, "that the divine intervention might have been nudged along by the multi-billion-dollar portfolio attached to your name?" The accusation, old and weary, hung in the air between them. Ethan sighed, the hope draining from his face. "She's not like that. She's the most genuine, faith-filled person I have ever met. She doesn't care about the mansion or the money." "Every person cares about the money," Harrison stated, "not as an opinion, but as a fundamental law of physics. They just have different ways of hiding it." Miles away, in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Ponca City, Andrea Smith was proving him wrong. She stood in the simple, sunlit kitchen of a small community church, her hands deftly packing lunch bags. She wasn't a member of the staff, she was a volunteer, one of the constants in their outreach program. Her smile was easy and genuine, her movements filled with a quiet, unshowy purpose. She listened to the worries of the other volunteers, offered a comforting word, a quiet prayer.
Her faith wasn't a banner she waved, it was the air she breathed. There was a grace about her, an unshakable core of peace that drew people in. Later, leaving the church, she bought a hot meal from a street vendor and without a moment's hesitation gave it to a man huddled in a nearby alleyway, offering him a simple "God bless you" before continuing on her way, never knowing she had just sealed her own fate. Back at the mansion, the decision had been made. Harrison called Ethan back into the library. On the desk, where moments before had been quarterly reports, now lay a pile of ragged, filthy clothes, a stained Carhartt jacket, torn jeans, a grimy beanie. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with confusion. "This is insurance," Harrison said, his face set like granite. "I will not allow a stranger to dismantle our family's legacy. I am going to disappear for a while. I am going to find out exactly who Andrea Smith is when she doesn't know a Kane is watching." "You're going to spy on her? Dad, no! This is insane. It's wrong." "What's wrong is leaving your family's entire future to chance and a prayer," Harrison countered coldly. "I'm going to become a ghost, a man no one would look at twice. I am going to see her world from the gutter, and I am going to find the truth. I pray to your God that you're right about her, son, but I don't run my business on prayer, and I won't run my family on it either." Ethan pleaded, argued, but it was like reasoning with a mountain. The decision was made. That night, Harrison Kane, the king of Ponca City, stood alone in a guest bathroom, looking at his reflection. He saw the powerful, tailored billionaire the world knew, but as he began to put on the ragged clothes, as he smudged dirt on his face and hid his expensive watch, another man began to emerge. A stranger, stripped of everything that defined him. He was becoming Harry, a ghost, and he could feel the weight of the lie, the profound, soul-deep transgression he was about to commit, settling over him like a shroud, a chilling premonition of the divine judgment that was to come. Harrison believes he's taking a necessary step to protect his family, while Ethan sees it as a profound betrayal of trust and faith. When it comes to protecting the people you love, is there a line that should never be crossed? Let me know where you stand in the comments below.
The first 48 hours were a symphony of misery, a brutal education in the art of being nothing. Harrison Kane ceased to exist. In his place was Harry, a man whose entire net worth was a threadbare sleeping bag and the clothes on his back. The first night, the Oklahoma wind, which had seemed so poetic from the library of Marland Mansion, was a physical enemy. It was a razor that sliced through his inadequate layers, finding every seam, every opening, and leaving a chill that settled deep in his bones. He tried to sleep in the alcove of a boarded-up storefront, the concrete a merciless thief of warmth. Every sound, a passing car, a distant siren, the rustle of unseen things in the alleyway was a threat. This was not the quiet, ordered silence of his mansion. This was the loud, predatory silence of the street. He learned about hunger, not the polite, intellectual hunger that came before a 7-course meal, but a gnawing, desperate ache in the pit of his stomach that consumed all other thoughts. He, a man who could buy any restaurant in the state on a whim, spent an entire morning paralyzed by the rich, torturous smell of bacon wafting from a diner, a scent that felt like a personal mockery. His pride, the cornerstone of his identity, initially stopped him from begging. By the second day, that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He held out a hand to a businessman in a suit not unlike his own and was met with a dismissive, contemptuous glare that was shockingly familiar. He had looked at people that way his entire life. To be on the receiving end of that look was to be spiritually flayed. He was invisible. He was garbage. He was nothing. This crucible of suffering began to do its work. It burned away the extraneous parts of him, his arrogance, his impatience, his sense of entitlement. All that was left was the raw, primal core of a man, cold, hungry, and for the first time in his adult life, profoundly afraid. He had thought this would be a game, a role to be played. He had not understood that it was a descent into a different circle of hell, a place where the currency was not money, but a single fleeting moment of human kindness. He found his first target location with the grim satisfaction of a hunter. A small, well-kept park near the city center, a place Andrea often walked through on her way to the library or the market. He found a bench that offered a clear view and made it his post. He sat there for hours, a ghost in plain sight, watching mothers with their strollers, old men playing chess, the mundane, beautiful pageant of a life he had never truly seen. On the third day, he saw her. Andrea walked into the park, a small bag of groceries in her hand. She was not dressed in the elegant clothes she wore for dinners with Ethan at the mansion. She was in simple jeans and a soft sweater, her hair tied back. She looked younger, more carefree. She sat on a bench opposite his, took out a book and an apple, and began to read. Harrison watched, his heart a strange, tight drum in his chest. He was waiting for the flaw, the crack in the facade. He expected her to be on her phone, absorbed in the trivialities of her world. But she wasn't. She was just present. She smiled at a toddler who waddled near her. She looked up at the sky, at the shape of the clouds, a look of simple, quiet contentment on her face. Then it happened. A young woman, clearly distressed, hurried past, her arms overloaded with files and a laptop bag. Her keys slipped from her grasp, falling to the pavement with a clatter she didn't hear. Andrea saw it. She didn't hesitate. She didn't call out. She simply stood, walked over, picked up the keys, and quickened her pace to catch up with the harried woman. Harrison watched the exchange from a distance. He saw the woman's frantic, grateful relief. He saw Andrea's calm, reassuring smile. She accepted the woman's thanks with a simple nod and walked back to her bench, not with the self-satisfied air of someone who had done a good deed, but with the simple, unthinking grace of someone for whom kindness was an instinct. She sat down and took a bite of her apple as if nothing had happened. It was such a small thing, a meaningless, everyday act of decency, but for Harrison, sitting on his cold bench in his filthy clothes, it was a tremor in the foundation of his entire worldview. He had built his life on the axiom of self-interest. People, in his experience, only did things for a return on their investment. What Andrea had just done had no ROI. It was a pure, uncalculated act of grace. He felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest. It was a confusing mix of admiration and a deep, unsettling shame. This was the woman he had judged. This was the woman he had set out to expose as a fraud. He had descended into the gutter to find her secret, and the first secret he had found was that she was genuinely, effortlessly good. This discovery did not bring him peace. It terrified him. If she was truly this person, then what did that make him? What was this monstrous, ugly thing he was doing? The wind picked up, rustling the autumn leaves across the pavement, and for the first time, the cold Harrison felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of a man beginning to realize he might be testing the wrong soul, and the soul he was truly putting on trial was his own. The question of who she was began to fade, replaced by a far more horrifying one. Who was he? Observation was no longer enough. The small, unsettling seed of Andrea's goodness had taken root in Harrison's mind, and it tormented him. He had to get closer. He needed to scratch at the surface of her compassion and see if it was merely a thin veneer. Cruelty, he knew, was the most effective solvent for false piety. He would provoke her, test the limits of her patience, and find the selfish, irritated core he knew must lie beneath. He chose his new hunting ground with care, the soup kitchen at the community church where he knew she volunteered on Thursdays. It was the perfect stage. Here, she was obligated to be kind. But he wouldn't be just another anonymous face in the line. He would be a problem. He arrived early, positioning himself near the entrance. He hadn't eaten in over a day, a self-imposed fast to make his desperation more authentic, and the gnawing hunger was a feral animal in his gut. When the doors opened, the warm, savory smell of beef stew washed over him,
and it took every ounce of his legendary self-control not to push his way to the front. When it was his turn, he found himself standing directly in front of her. She stood behind the serving counter, an apron over her clothes, her hair tied back, her face glowing with a soft warmth in the steamy air. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just another broken man, filthy, unshaven, his eyes downcast. The invisibility he had once found so demeaning was now his most powerful weapon. "Welcome," she said, her voice the same gentle tone he had heard in the park. "We're so glad you're here. What can I get for you?" "Food," he grunted, his voice a low, gravelly rasp he had been practicing. He thrust his tray forward. She ladled a generous portion of stew into his bowl. "Here you go. There's bread at the end of the line and coffee." This was his moment. Instead of moving on, he stayed put, blocking the line. "This is it?" he demanded, his voice louder now, laced with contempt. "This watery slop? This is what you call a meal?" A few heads turned. The volunteer next to Andrea, a stern-looking older woman, shot him a look of pure venom. But Andrea's expression didn't change. Her smile didn't falter. She simply looked at him, her hazel eyes full of a calm, unwavering patience. "I'm sorry it's not to your liking, sir," she said, her voice still soft. "We do the best we can with what God provides." "God?" Harrison scoffed, the word feeling like poison in his mouth. "He doesn't seem to be providing much for me, lady. Look at me. Does it look like I've been blessed?" He was channeling every bitter, cynical thought he'd ever had, using his own dark philosophy as a script. The other volunteers started to step forward. "That's enough, Martha." "It's all right, Martha," Andrea said, placing a gentle hand on the woman's arm. She never broke eye contact with Harrison. Her gaze was not pitying. It was something far more unnerving. It was understanding. "I know it can feel that way," she said to him, her voice dropping to a more intimate, conspiratorial level, as if they were the only two people in the room. "Sometimes the darkness feels so big, it's all you can see. It feels like God has turned his back. But he hasn't, I promise you, he hasn't." She reached under the counter and pulled out a small sealed packet of cookies, the kind reserved for children, and a fresh orange. She placed them on his tray. "My name is Andrea. What's yours?" The simple, human question disarmed him completely. He had expected anger, annoyance, dismissal. He had not expected to be seen. "Harry?" he mumbled, the name feeling clumsy on his tongue. "Well, Harry," she said, her smile finally reaching her eyes, "I'll be praying for you tonight. I'll pray that you find a little bit of light in the darkness." She turned to the next person in line, the moment over. Harrison stood there for a second, his heart hammering against his ribs, a strange hot feeling behind his eyes. He was stunned into silence. He had come here with a battering ram of cruelty, intending to smash through her defenses, and she had met him not with a shield, but with an open door. He shuffled to an empty table in the corner and sat, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up his spoon. He took a bite of the stew. It wasn't slop. It was rich and hot and savory, the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He ate like a wolf, every bite a surrender. He saved the orange and the cookies, hoarding them like treasure. He watched her for the rest of the hour. She moved with a tireless grace, offering the same gentle respect to every person who came through the line, no matter how broken or dirty or angry they were. He realized with a chilling certainty that this was not an act. This was not a performance for a billionaire's son. This was who she was, down to the marrow of her bones. Her goodness wasn't a cloak she put on. It was the skin she lived in. He left the church and walked for miles, the city lights a meaningless blur. Her words echoed in his head. "I'll be praying for you tonight." No one had prayed for Harrison Kane in 30 years. He had considered himself beyond the reach of such things. He was a god in his own universe, the creator of his own fortune. But Harry was a broken man, a man who lived in the darkness. And for the first time, the thought of someone praying for a little bit of light felt less like a foolish sentiment and more like a lifeline he was too proud and too stubborn to grab. The test was failing spectacularly. He had set out to expose her character, and was instead being forced to confront the terrifying, gaping void where his own was supposed to be.
The prayer haunted him. For 2 days, Harrison, as Harry, wandered the streets of Ponca City in a daze, Andrea's parting words echoing in the hollow spaces of his soul. "I'll pray that you find a little bit of light in the darkness." It was a sentiment he should have dismissed as naive, the empty platitude of a do-gooder. Yet it clung to him, a strange and persistent warmth in the relentless cold of his new reality. His mission had become corrupted. The cold, clinical objective, to find the flaw, to expose the angle, was now tangled with a desperate, deeply personal need to understand. How could someone be so good? What was the source of that unwavering grace? In his world, such profound selflessness had to be a front for something, a secret ambition, a hidden source of funding, a carefully concealed weakness. He had to know. He began to follow her. It felt like the ugliest thing he had ever done, a new low in a descent that seemed to have no bottom. He used the survival skills he was rapidly acquiring, how to blend into the background, how to be utterly invisible, and turned them to this sordid purpose. He kept his distance, a ghost trailing a woman of light. He watched her go from the church to a part-time job at the local library, where she read stories to children with a gentle, captivating enthusiasm. He watched her visit a nursing home, not for any official charity event, but to sit and play checkers with an elderly man who seemed to have no other visitors. Every observation was another piece of evidence against his own cynical thesis. Her life was a quiet, consistent tapestry of service. He was beginning to believe he was wrong, that she was simply a saint. But then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, he saw something that didn't fit. After leaving the library, she didn't go home. She got on a city bus heading not towards the nicer, historic neighborhoods, but south, deep into the poorest, most neglected part of Ponca City. It was a landscape of cracked pavement, boarded-up windows, and weary resignation. This was a place the Canes in their circle pretended didn't exist. Harrison's heart began to pound with a grim, vindicated excitement. This was it, the secret, the hidden life. Was this where a secret lover lived? A drug deal? A clandestine meeting to sell information about his son? Every dark, cynical possibility he had ever imagined came roaring back to life. He hailed a taxi, one of the few extravagances he allowed his disguised self, and instructed the driver to follow the bus, his voice a low, urgent command. The bus lumbered through the decaying streets and finally let Andrea off in front of a dilapidated 2-story brick building. It had once been a small school, but now it looked forgotten, the windows grimy, the yard a patch of stubborn weeds. A faded, hand-painted sign hung crookedly over the door, the Shepherd's Gate Community Center. Harrison paid the driver and got out, pulling his beanie down low. He watched from across the street as Andrea, pulling a key from her pocket, let herself in. There was no one else around. The place looked deserted, almost condemned. What in God's name was she doing in there? He waited. An hour passed, then another. The rain fell in a steady, miserable drizzle. Finally, a small, battered-looking church van pulled up, and a woman helped a handful of children, ranging from about 5 to 10, out of the back and hurried them inside. Moments later, the lights inside the community center flickered on, casting a warm, yellow glow through the grimy windows. Harrison's curiosity now was a ravenous, all-consuming fire. He crept across the street, his ragged clothes allowing him to blend into the urban decay. He moved around to the side of the building, where a low window offered a partial view into what looked like a main common room. He wiped the rain and grime from the glass with his sleeve and peered inside, and the world fell away. What he saw was not a scene of illicit activity or secret dealings. It was a scene of such profound, unvarnished love that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. The room was shabby, the furniture old and mismatched, but it was clean and warm. And in the center of it all was Andrea. She was on her knees, at their level, surrounded by the small group of foster children.
There was no performance, no audience. There was only her. He saw her gently bandage the scraped knee of a little boy, her touch infinitely tender. He saw her help a young girl with her homework, her expression of patient encouragement. He saw her lead them all in a simple song, her face alight with a joy so pure and so radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire dreary room. This wasn't charity. This wasn't volunteering. This was motherhood in its most elemental, selfless form. His gaze was then drawn to one little girl, no older than 6, with big, fearful eyes and tightly braided hair. She clung to Andrea's side, a silent, tiny shadow. Andrea's attention to this child was different, imbued with a special, fierce tenderness. He watched as Andrea knelt before the little girl, whispering something that made a shy, fragile smile appear on her face. The little girl's name, he would later learn, was Wendy, and the bond between them was a sacred, unspoken covenant. Harrison fell back from the window as if he'd been burned. He stumbled back into the alleyway, his back sliding down the wet brick wall until he was sitting on the cold, unforgiving pavement. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, but he didn't feel it. He couldn't breathe. This was her secret. This was the shocking discovery. It wasn't a flaw, it was a treasure. It wasn't a weakness, it was a strength so profound he couldn't even comprehend it. He had come here expecting to find a gold digger, a woman scheming to get her hands on the Kane fortune. Instead, he had found a woman who was secretly, silently spending her own life, her own heart, her own soul to create a haven for the forgotten children of the world. The sheer, staggering force of his misjudgment crashed down upon him, the arrogance, the cynicism, the ugly, soul-deep certainty that everyone was driven by greed. It was all a lie. He was the lie. He sat there in the rain, a homeless man in a dark alley, and wept, not for his cold or his hunger, but for the sudden, devastating revelation of his own spiritual poverty. He was the richest man in Oklahoma, and in that moment, he knew with a certainty that shook him to his very core that he was the poorest man on earth. The image of Andrea kneeling on that worn linoleum floor, surrounded by those children, was burned into Harrison's mind. It was a sacred image, a tableau grace that replayed itself over and over, mocking the ugly, profane assumptions that had led him to this alley. He couldn't leave. He felt rooted to the spot, a silent sentinel in the rain, compelled by a force he didn't understand. He was no longer a spy trying to uncover a secret. He was a pilgrim who had stumbled upon a shrine. He stayed there until the church van returned hours later to pick up the children. He watched as Andrea hugged each child goodbye, her farewell to the little girl, Wendy, a longer, more poignant embrace. After the van pulled away, a single, older woman in a faded coat emerged, locking the community center door. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. This was his chance. Harrison knew he couldn't approach Andrea, not yet, but this woman might have the answers he so desperately needed. He pulled himself to his feet, a plan forming in his shattered mind. He would not approach her as an interrogator, but as a supplicant, as Harry, a man in need. He intercepted her as she walked towards the bus stop, his posture hunched, his voice a low, respectful rasp. "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am." The woman, whose name was Maria, flinched, clutching her purse tighter. She had the guarded, wary eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime in a tough neighborhood. "I ain't got no money," she said, her voice flat. "No, ma'am, I'm not asking for money," Harrison said quickly. I saw the light on in there. The sign says it's a community center. I was just wondering, do you have coffee or maybe a place a man could get warmed for a minute?" Maria's expression softened slightly. She looked him up and down, taking in the wet, ragged clothes, the genuine exhaustion in his eyes. He was just another piece of wreckage washed up on the shores of her world. "We are closed for the night," she said, her voice tired but no longer hostile. "And we're not a shelter. We're a place for the kids, an after-school safe house mostly, foster kids." "Oh," Harrison said, feigning disappointment. That's a good thing, a real good thing." He paused, then added, as if an afterthought, "That young woman in there, the one with the kind eyes, She seems real good with them kids." A sad, weary smile touched Maria's lips. "Good?" she said, her voice a mix of reverence and frustration. "Honey, you have no idea. That girl, Andrea, is a living, breathing saint, and it's going to kill her." The words sent a jolt through Harrison. "What do you mean?" Maria sighed, a plume of vapor in the cold night air. She seemed to need to unburden herself. "This place, the Shepherd's Gate, this was her parents' dream. Michael and Sarah Smith, best people you'd ever meet, filled with the Holy Spirit, the both of them. They poured their whole lives into this community, into this building. They were going to make it something real." She looked off into the distance, lost in a painful memory. Then, about 5 back, a drunk driver ran a red light, killed them both instantly. Andrea was only 18. Harrison felt the air leave his lungs. The casual, unnamed parents he had dismissed as nothing were now taking shape as martyrs. "When they died," Maria continued, her voice dropping, "the funding dried up. The church helped, but it wasn't enough. The city was going to condemn the building. But Andrea, she made a promise, on their graves, I think, a promise to God that she wouldn't let their dream die." She looked at Harrison, her eyes shining with a fierce, protective light. "This girl, Andrea, is a living, breathing saint, and it's going to kill her." The full weight of the truth crashed down on Harrison with the force of a physical blow. The money, the secret, the angle, it was all there, but it was the inverse of everything he had imagined. He had been looking for a woman trying to get money, and he had found one who was secretly, desperately giving it all away. She wasn't trying to attach herself to the Kane legacy for a payday. She was fighting, with every fiber of her being, to uphold the sacred legacy of her own parents. The promise she was keeping wasn't to his son, it was to her God. "She's a good girl," Maria finished, shaking her head as the bus approached. "I hope that new fella she's with, the rich boy, is good to her. I hope he knows what a treasure he's got." The bus hissed to a stop, and Maria got on, leaving Harrison alone on the dark, wet street. He was no longer just a man who had made a terrible misjudgment. He was a spiritual criminal. He, with his mountains of useless money, had been judging a woman who was quietly, miraculously performing the loaves and fishes. His cynical test was not just an insult to her. It was a blasphemy against the very idea of faith, sacrifice, and unconditional love. He looked back at the dark, silent community center. It wasn't just a building, it was a testament, a monument to a promise between a daughter and her parents, between a soul and her God. And he, Harrison Kane, had treated it and her like a crime scene. The darkness she had spoken of in the soup kitchen, he was beginning to understand it now. He was the darkness, and he knew with a terrifying and absolute certainty that he had to find a way to get into the light. He had to get inside that building.
The next morning, Harrison did something he never could have imagined. He walked back to the Shepherd's Gate, not as a spy, but as Harry, a homeless man looking for a way to repay a kindness. He found Maria unlocking the front door, her face etched with the same bone-deep weariness as the night before. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy, holding his grimy beanie in his hands as a sign of respect. I don't have money, but I'm strong. I can work. Is there anything at all I can do to help? A floor to sweep, boxes to move? I just want to earn the meal you gave me." Maria looked at him, her eyes skeptical but seeing the raw sincerity in his plea. She saw a broken man trying to reclaim a piece of his own dignity. She sighed. "Lord knows we can't afford a handyman," she said, gesturing for him to come inside. "The back storeroom's a disaster. You can start there." And so Harrison Kane, a man whose commands could move global markets, spent the day moving dusty boxes, organizing donated clothes, and mopping floors in a rundown community center in the poorest part of Ponca City. The work was hard, his body ached, and it was the most meaningful thing he had done in 30 years. He worked in the background, a silent, diligent ghost. He saw Andrea arrive in the afternoon, her face lighting up as the children came in. He watched her from a distance, the sight of her patient, unconditional love, a constant, painful sermon to his own hardened heart. During a break, he found himself sitting at a small table, trying to fix a broken wooden toy.
The little girl, Wendy, the one with the big, fearful eyes, approached him timidly. She didn't speak. She just stood there, watching his large, clumsy hands work. He looked up at her. "It's a horse," he said softly, "but he's lost a leg." Wendy just nodded, her gaze fixed on the toy. He finally managed to wedge the broken leg back into place, securing it with a piece of twine. It wasn't elegant, but it was sturdy. He held it out to her. "Here, he can stand now." She reached out with a small, hesitant hand and took the horse. She looked at it, then up at him, and for the first time a tiny, fragile smile touched her lips. It was a moment of connection so pure, so uncalculated, that it pierced Harrison's soul. This small, broken child had just given him a gift of trust he knew with a certainty that shamed him he had not earned. Andrea approached, a warm smile on her face. "That was kind of you, Harry." She sat down at the small table, her presence creating a small circle of warmth. "Wendy doesn't open up to many people." "She's a good kid," Harrison mumbled, his eyes on the table. He couldn't look at Andrea, afraid of what she might see in his face. "They're all good kids," Andrea said softly, her gaze sweeping across the noisy, chaotic room. "They've just been given heavier burdens than most." She looked back at him. "Just like you, Harry, just like all of us. We all have our burdens to carry. The trick is not letting them convince you that you have to carry them alone. That's what faith is for. It's knowing God is there to help you carry the load." Her words were not a lecture. They were an offering, a simple statement of her profound, unshakable truth. Harrison felt a lifetime of cynical certainties begin to crumble under the weight of her simple faith. He had always been the one carrying the load. He had carried his company, his family, his fortune. He had never asked for help from anyone, least of all from a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He had seen faith as a crutch for the weak, not a source of strength. He stayed for the rest of the week. He became Harry the handyman. He fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom. He patched the hole in the drywall. He organized the pantry. With every small act of service, a piece of his old arrogant self chip away, leaving something raw and vulnerable in its place. He wasn't just fixing a building. He was performing a penance. He was trying to repair the damage to his own soul. One evening, after all the children had gone home, he stayed late to help Andrea and Maria clean up. He found Andrea in the quiet, empty common room staring at a stack of bills on a small desk, her face a mask of quiet desperation. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. She looked up, startled, then gave him a weary smile. "Just the usual," she said, gesturing to the papers. "The rent, the utilities, the notice that our insurance is going up. Another month of robbing Peter to pay Paul." "Why do you do it?" he asked, the question coming from a place of genuine, desperate curiosity. "Why carry all this on your own?" She looked at him, and her gaze was so direct, so full of a strength he couldn't comprehend, that he felt pinned in place. "Because God doesn't call us to do what is easy, Harry. He calls us to do what is right. This place, it's my promise. It's the only thing my parents left behind that truly matters, and as long as I have breath in my body, I will not let it fail." Her conviction was absolute. It was as solid and real as the floor beneath their feet. Later that night, Harrison did not return to his cold alcove. He walked for hours until he found himself standing in front of the oldest church in Ponca City, its stone steeple a dark finger pointing towards a starless, unforgiving sky. He went inside. The sanctuary was empty, silent, and vast. It smelled of old wood and incense and the faint, lingering echo of 1,000 prayers. He, a man who had not set foot in a church in over 30 years, walked down the center aisle and knelt at the altar. He didn't know the words. He didn't know the protocol. All he knew was the profound, crushing weight of his own emptiness. He thought of Andrea's faith, of Wendy's fragile smile, of the monstrous lie he was living. And for the first time since he was a child, Harrison Kane prayed. It wasn't a prayer of supplication or of praise. It was a raw, broken, and desperate confession, whispered into the holy silence. "God," he began, the word a foreign, clumsy thing in his mouth, "I don't know if you're there, but Andrea, She thinks you are. And I am a liar. I am a thief. I am a hollow man. I have everything, and I have nothing. Please, show me the light she talks about, because I am in the darkness. I am so lost." He knelt there for a long time, the silence of the church his only answer. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. And the spiritual crisis he had been running from his entire life had finally, mercifully, begun.
While Harrison was finding his soul in the darkness of Ponca City's streets, Ethan was living in a gilded cage of anxiety. His father had vanished. For a week, he'd honored his father's insane demand for secrecy, telling inquiring staff that Harrison was on a digital detox at a remote retreat. But the excuse was wearing thin, and a deep, gnawing unease had taken root in his heart. This wasn't just a test, it was a cruel, obsessive quest, and the silence from his father was becoming ominous. Driven by a mix of worry and frustration, Ethan did something he'd never done before. He went into his father's private study, a room he'd been taught since childhood was more sacred than a church. He was looking for a clue, a note, a map, anything. What he found was far worse. On the corner of his father's immaculate desk, partially hidden under a stack of financial reports, was a large manila envelope. Inside were not business documents, but high-resolution surveillance photos. The first one made his blood run cold. It was a picture of Andrea, taken with a long-range lens, walking in the park. The next showed her at the library. Another, more shocking one, showed her talking to a filthy, bearded homeless man outside the community church. Ethan's confusion quickly curdled into a sickening, horrifying realization. His father hadn't just become a homeless man. He had hired professionals to document his cruel experiment. He was building a case against the woman he loved. He dug deeper into the envelope, his hands trembling with rage. He found a preliminary background report detailing Andrea's finances, her parents' tragic death, her connection to the struggling Shepherd's Gate Community Center. It was all there, every intimate, painful detail of her life, laid bare in the cold, clinical language of a private investigator. This wasn't about protection. This was a violation. It was a calculated, soul-deep act of distrust that desecrated everything Ethan held sacred. His father's cynicism wasn't a quirk. It was a sickness, a cancer that saw shadows and deceit where there was only light. At that moment, the door to the study opened, and Harrison walked in. He was no longer Harry. He had returned to the mansion in the dead of night, drawn by a need to access a resource he couldn't get on the street: information. He wanted to understand the financial black hole that was the Shepherd's Gate, to see the numbers behind Andrea's faith. He was clean, shaven, and dressed in one of his expensive cashmere sweaters, but the transformation was more than skin deep. The hard, arrogant certainty in his eyes was gone, replaced by a haunted, weary introspection. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, and that ghost was himself. He froze when he saw Ethan standing by his desk, the damning photos and reports clutched in his son's white-knuckled fist. The silence in the room was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket of betrayal. "What is this?" Ethan's voice was a low, shaking whisper, but it carried the force of an earthquake. "What in God's name have you done?" Harrison had no defense. The evidence of his transgression was laid out between them. "Ethan, let me explain." "Explain?" Ethan's voice cracked, and the whisper erupted into a roar of pure, righteous fury. He lunged forward, sweeping the photos off the desk. They scattered across the priceless Persian rug like fallen leaves. "Explain this sickness, this obsession? You talk about legacy, about protecting this family, but you don't know the first thing about family. Family is built on trust, on faith, and you are incapable of either." Every word was a perfectly aimed blow, striking at the very core of Harrison's newly fragile soul.
He had spent his life believing he was the strong one, the protector, and Ethan was the soft, naive heir. But in this moment, seeing the fierce, unwavering conviction in his eyes, he saw his mistake. Ethan's faith wasn't a weakness, it was an anchor, a source of moral clarity that Harrison had never possessed. "You don't know her, Ethan," Harrison stammered, his voice weak. "You don't know what she does, the sacrifices she—" "I know her heart," Ethan shouted, his face contorted with a pain so deep it seemed to tear him apart. "And that's something you could never understand, because you don't have one. You sit in this museum and you judge the world from a distance, but she is out there, living a real life, a life of purpose, and you dare to spy on her, to treat her like a criminal?" Ethan's eyes fell on the photo of Andrea talking to the homeless man, to his own father in disguise. The sheer, twisted sickness of it hit him with a fresh wave of nausea. "And this," he said, his voice dropping with disgust. "You got so close. You let her talk to you. You let her be kind to you, all while you were holding a knife behind your back. You are a monster." Harrison flinched as if he'd been physically struck. The word landed with the devastating weight of a divine judgment. He had come to the same conclusion himself, kneeling in the dark silence of the church. To hear it from his own son was his penance made real. "I was wrong, Ethan. I was so wrong." But Ethan was beyond hearing it. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. His only thought now was of Andrea. She was out there loving a man whose family was committing this grotesque violation against her. He had to warn her. He had to protect her from the poison that ran in his own bloodline. "I'm going to tell her," Ethan declared, his eyes blazing with a cold, protective fire. "I'm going to tell her everything about this disgusting test, about the spies, about you. She deserves the truth, and if she never wants to see either of us again, then that is the price we pay. That is the price you will pay for what you have done." He turned and stormed out of the library, leaving Harrison standing alone amidst the scattered evidence of his sins. The confrontation he had dreaded was over, but it was so much worse than he had imagined. He hadn't just been challenged, he had been convicted. His son, the boy he had tried to shape in his own image, had just become his judge and jury. And as he heard the front door of the mansion slam shut, Harrison knew that the shatter point was not just between him and his son. It was a schism that was about to rip Andrea's world and his own last chance at redemption completely apart.
Ethan drove through the streets of Ponca City as if pursued by demons. His father's face, the damning photographs, the sheer, calculated cruelty of the deception, it all swirled in his mind, a toxic storm of rage and heartbreak. He was a man caught between two worlds, the profound, simple goodness of Andrea's life and the corrupt, cynical darkness of his own inheritance. By telling her the truth, he knew he might lose her forever. The foundation of their love, which he had believed to be built on honesty and faith, was actually a carefully constructed lie from his side. But to let her walk into a marriage, into his family without knowing the truth, that was an even greater sin. He found her where he knew she would be, at the Shepherd's Gate. It was late afternoon, and the chaotic, joyful noise of the children spilled out into the dreary street. When she saw his car pull up, she came out to greet him, her face breaking into a beautiful, radiant smile that felt like a physical blow to his guilt-ridden heart. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" she said, her voice full of happy surprise. "Is everything okay?" "No," he said, his own voice sounding foreign and strained. "No, Andrea, nothing is okay." The light in her eyes faded, replaced by a look of deep concern. She led him inside, into a small, cluttered office away from the children. The room was humble, filled with second-hand furniture and the lingering smell of crayons, but it felt more sacred to him than any room in his father's mansion. "What is it?" she asked, her hand gently touching his arm. "You're scaring me." And so, he told her. The words came out in a torrent of shame and self-loathing.
He told her about his father's cynical worldview, his obsessive need to protect the family fortune, and the monstrous, unforgivable test he had concocted. He told her about the disguise, the private investigators, the photographs. He confessed that the kind-hearted handyman, Harry, the man she had prayed for, was a lie. He was Harrison Kane. Andrea listened, her hand slowly falling from his arm. The color drained from her face. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a look of such profound, quiet devastation that it shattered what was left of Ethan's heart. This was not the explosive, angry reaction he had braced himself for. It was a silent, deep, and utter fracturing of trust. She looked at him as if he were a complete stranger, a man she had never truly seen before. Harry? She whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. She thought of the conversations they had, the vulnerability she had shared, the prayers she had offered up for that broken man. It was all a performance, a violation of a trust so sacred it felt blasphemous. "I didn't know, Andrea, I swear," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking. "Not until an hour ago. I would never. I love you. You have to believe that." But how could she? He was a part of it. He was a Kane. His entire world was built on a foundation of power and control, the very antitheses of her own. Before she could find the words to respond, a shrill, piercing sound cut through the air. The fire alarm. At the same time, Maria burst into the office, her face a mask of terror. "Fire! In the kitchen! It's spreading fast!" The next few minutes were a blur of primal chaos. The smell of smoke, thick and acrid, filled the air. Andrea, her personal heartbreak instantly eclipsed by a fierce protective instinct, flew into action, her voice calm and authoritative as she and Maria herded the terrified children out of the building and into the rainy street. Ethan, shaking but desperate to help, followed, grabbing as many coats and blankets as he could. They huddled on the opposite sidewalk, a small, shivering band of refugees, and watched in horror as thick black smoke began to pour from the windows of the Shepherd's Gate. The sound of distant sirens grew closer, a mournful, inadequate cry against the roar of the growing blaze. Andrea stood frozen, her face illuminated by the flickering, hellish orange glow. She wasn't just watching a building burn. She was watching her parents' legacy, her promise to God, her entire life's purpose turn to ash. The weight of it all, the fire, the impossible bills, and now the grotesque betrayal of the man she loved and the father she had prayed for, it all came crashing down on her. Her strength finally gave out. She sank to her knees on the wet pavement, a single broken sob escaping her lips. The little girl, Wendy, ran to her, wrapping her tiny arms around her, both of them weeping in the face of the flames. Miles away, in the library of Marland Mansion, Harrison was watching the local news, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, when the breaking news alert flashed across the screen. Fire engulfs community center in Southside Ponca City. The live helicopter footage showed a building he now knew with intimate, painful familiarity, the Shepherd's Gate. He shot to his feet, the whiskey glass shattering on the floor. His blood ran cold. He saw the fire trucks, the smoke, the small, huddled group of people across the street, and he knew. He knew with a divine, terrifying certainty that this was it. This was the judgment. His son had just revealed his sin, and now God was delivering the punishment. He was faced with his final, ultimate choice. He could remain here, in the safety of his mansion. He could remain a ghost, let the building burn, let her dream die. He could wire a massive, anonymous donation tomorrow, an easy, sterile act of charity to assuage the guilt. It would be the safe, logical, cowardly choice. Or he could go there. He could shed the disguise of Harry and the armor of Harrison Kane and walk into that firestorm of her grief and his own making. He could face her not as a spy or a billionaire, but as the broken, penitent man he had become kneeling in that church. It was a choice between the easy absolution of money and the hard, painful path of true redemption. He looked at the portrait of his wife, her gentle, painted eyes seeming to ask him one final question. Who are you going to be? Without a second's hesitation, Harrison turned and ran from the room, grabbing the keys to his car, his heart pounding with a terror and a clarity he had never known. He was no longer running from the truth. He was running towards it. He was running to the fire.
The scene at the Shepherd's Gate was one of controlled chaos and raw despair. Firefighters battled the blaze, their dark figures silhouetted against a backdrop of angry, swirling flames. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sorrow. Across the street, the small flock of children and volunteers were being tended to by paramedics, their faces smudged with soot and streaked with tears. Ethan stood helplessly beside Andrea, who was still kneeling on the wet pavement, her arms wrapped tightly around a sobbing Wendy. The fight had gone out of Andrea. The serene strength that had been her anchor was gone, replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a soul that had endured too much. The fire was not just an accident, it felt like a verdict, a sign that her fight, her promise, her faith, it had all been for nothing. Ethan's heart broke for her, his own painful confession now seeming like a selfish, trivial wound in the face of this catastrophic loss. Into this tableau of wreckage, a sleek black Bentley sedan pulled up, its silent, powerful engine an alien sound in this world of sirens and shouts. The car was so out of place, so aggressively opulent, that it commanded the attention of everyone on the street. The driver's door opened, and Harrison Kane stepped out. He was no longer Harry the ghost, nor was he the imperious billionaire from the mansion. He was the man from the church, his face stripped of all its masks, revealing the raw, penitent soul beneath. He wore a simple dark coat, but his presence was immense, his focus absolute. He walked past the police barricades as if they weren't there, his eyes fixed on one person and one person only, Andrea. Ethan saw him first and stiffened, a protective instinct rising in him. Dad, no, not now. She can't. But Harrison walked right past his son, his gaze never wavering. He stopped a few feet from Andrea and knelt down, bringing himself to her level on the cold, unforgiving pavement. The gesture was so foreign to his nature, so profoundly humbling that it stunned Ethan into silence. Andrea, Harrison said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the surrounding chaos. It was the voice of the man who had knelt at the altar, a voice of brokenness and contrition. She looked up, her eyes empty and red-rimmed. She saw the face of the man she had known as Harry, the man she had prayed for, now clean-shaven and wearing the clothes of a king. The two identities merged, and the full, crushing weight of the betrayal washed over her again. "You," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It was all a lie." "Yes," Harrison said, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was. I came into your life as a liar and a judge, consumed by a darkness I couldn't see past. You showed me kindness. You prayed for me to find the light." He took a shaky breath, his gaze moving from her face to the burning building. "And this is my darkness, my judgment. I brought this into your life, and I am so sorry, more sorry than words can say." He wasn't making excuses, he was taking responsibility, not for the fire, but for the entire world of Cain he had created. He then looked at the weeping child in her arms. "Wendy," he said, his impossibly gentle voice, "I fixed your toy horse, remember? I promise you, I will fix this too." He stood up and turned to face both Andrea and his son. He was no longer just a penitent, he was a man with a purpose. "This is not a donation," he declared, his voice ringing with a new, holy authority. "This is a covenant, a promise. My family's legacy has been one of building things, buildings of steel and glass, built on foundations of pride. That ends tonight. We will rebuild this place, Andrea. Not just this building,
but your parents' dream. We will establish the Michael and Sarah Smith Foundation, a national organization dedicated to protecting children like these. My family's resources, our name, our power, from this moment on, it will serve your parents' legacy. It will serve your faith." He looked at Ethan, and for the first time, son saw father not as a tyrant or a cynic, but a man redeemed. "This will be our new work, Ethan, our true inheritance." He had offered her more than money. He had offered him his entire empire, not as a buyout, but as an atonement. He was laying his fortune, his name, and his soul at the feet of her faith, begging for a chance to help her rebuild. Andrea stared at him, her mind reeling. The rage and betrayal she felt were warring with the sheer staggering magnitude of his confession and his promise. She looked at the burning building, the ashes of her life's work. She looked at Ethan, his face full of a desperate, pleading love, and she looked at Harrison, a broken king offering up his crown. Her faith, the one that had been battered and bruised, whispered to her in the chaos. God doesn't call us to do what is easy. He calls us to do what is right. Anger was easy. Resentment was easy. Forgiveness, grace, that was the hard, holy work. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet, helping a still shaking Wendy to stand beside her. She looked Harrison directly in the eye. "Vengeance is the Lord's," she said softly, her voice trembling but clear. "But grace is something we are asked to give." It was not a full absolution, not yet, but it was an opening. It was the beginning of a possibility. It was her choosing the light. The story didn't end that night amidst the smoke and ashes. It ended 1 year later under a brilliant, hopeful Oklahoma sky. They stood on the steps of the new, beautiful Shepherd's Gate Community Center. It was bigger, stronger, filled with light and laughter. Harrison was there, his face softer, the lines of arrogance erased and replaced by lines of purpose. Ethan stood beside Andrea, his hand holding hers, their love rebuilt on the unshakable foundation of truth. And between them stood Wendy, holding both of their other hands, no longer a foster child, but a daughter, her adoption finalized a month prior. They were a family, not a perfect one, but a real one. A family that had been forged in the fires of deceit, tested by unimaginable trials, but ultimately redeemed by the radical, terrifying, and beautiful power of forgiveness. Harrison had gone into the darkness looking for a sinner, and instead, by the grace of a woman's unwavering faith, found his own salvation.
Harrison Kane went into the darkness looking for a flaw in someone else and was forced to confront the abyss in his own soul. He thought his inheritance was the fortune he had built, but Andrea and Ethan showed him it was the faith he had lost. It begs a question for all of us. What is the true legacy we are building? Is it measured in what we own or in what we give away? This story is a testament to the idea that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what truly matters. That the deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to the most profound acts of grace. If this story moved you, please join our community by subscribing to Epic Narrative Tales. We believe stories are more than just entertainment. They are a way to understand ourselves and the world around us. And we want to hear from you. Go to the comments right now and share your answer. Was Andrea right to forgive him, or are some betrayals too deep to ever truly heal? There's no right or wrong answer. Let's talk about it. Thank you for watching, and may you always find the light, especially in the darkness.